Alright guys, so this video is going to cover cell communication. This is definitely going to be something that you have not seen before. This is not a topic that we cover in freshman level biology. It's kind of in the background, but it's not ever really covered specifically. Now, I do want you to understand that cell communication is very intricate and very specific. Each pathway has a very specific set of actions that are going to take place. And so as we're going through this lesson, even though it may feel kind of difficult, this is actually an overview, okay? Everything that we're going to talk about are just some of the big ideas behind cell communication. And so just like you can communicate with other people, our cells communicate with each other. That communication can be short distance, it can be long distance. But cells, that basic unit of life, they are constantly communicating and sending messages via chemical signals. And so they do that in order to respond to their environment. So we know that we have to maintain homeostasis, and one of the ways that we do that is through cell communication. And so a lot of these communication processes, they go back, way back when it comes to evolutionary lines, and they're shared across a majority of organisms. Now, there's a lot of different processes that are directed by cell communication. These include things like differentiation, like how does a cell know to become a skin cell, or how does a cell know to become a muscle cell. Timing of the cell cycle. So then this is the next lesson in this unit, is the cell cycle, understanding cells dividing. How does the cell know when to divide or when to stop dividing? That's all part of communication pathways. Any kind of physiological responses, any kind of increasing heart rate, decreasing heart rate, sweating, all of those are examples of physiological responses. Your immune system is very much all about communication and cells recognizing and communicating with each other. And pretty much a lot of the main activities of the body are in some way going to be regulated through cell communication. Now, as I mentioned earlier, cell communication can be short distance or long distance. Just like you could talk to someone face to face, you could also be in a different location and call them over a phone. There's going to be different types. And so the way they communicate is through chemical messengers. And chemical messengers can be different things. That chemical messenger could be a hormone, it could be a protein, it could be a neurotransmitter. It could be an ion. It really just depends on the pathway. And as I mentioned, each pathway is going to be very, very specific. So these are just some general things that can be involved. In terms of your close contact, you have local regulators, and these are the ones that are traveling short distance. A lot of times the cells are physically touching. There could be cell-to-cell contact, or they're traveling from a cell to a nearby cell. And two examples of this that you'll find in your body are paracrine signaling, which are like growth factors. They're going to spread to nearby cells and stimulate cell division. Or it could be synaptic signaling. Now, synaptic signaling, the synapse is the space between two neurons. We haven't really covered this yet. I don't know how much experience you've had with neurons, but just to kind of give you an idea. So a neuron is a very specialized nerve cell, and it has these extensions. It has a structure called a cell body, and it has these dendrites, and then it kind of has this long tail. And then that tail is going to release neurotransmitters. And then the next neuron has those dendrites, and then it's got a long tail. And so this is an example of synaptic signaling. So the synapse is the gap between two neurons, and this is where neurotransmitters get released. Or it could be the synapse between a nerve cell and a muscle cell. And so as you can see, that's a close distance. There you have one cell, here's the other cell, and they're just going from one cell to the other. So that's definitely going to be an example of close contact. Now, another example are plasmodesmata and animal cell junctions. So when you did your cell parts lab, plasmodesmata are the little tiny holes in the plant cell wall, and that allows the cytoplasm to kind of move and be continuous between plant cells. You could also have animal cell junctions like gap junctions, and like in our heart we have gap junctions, and it allows things to pass through from one cell to another. Or you could have the cells physically touching each other. Like that's one mechanism for cell division, is that when cells touch, a lot of times that tells the cell that they do not need to continue dividing. So all of these are local, short distance examples. And so this is just a picture. These are gap junctions here. There's plasmodesmata there. You can literally see that it's cell to cell. They're nearby each other. Now, the long distance is called endocrine signaling, and you've probably heard that word before with the endocrine system. And the key to endocrine is hormones. And by definition, a hormone is a chemical signal that travels, and it travels via the bloodstream. So, for instance, adrenaline. Adrenaline is going to be released from the adrenal glands, which sit on top of your kidneys, but that hormone is going to travel through the blood, and it's going to affect organs like your heart. Your heart rate is going to go up. It's going to affect your blood vessels. It's going to affect your bladder and your digestive system. And so even though it was secreted on top of the kidneys, it's going to affect many different organs of the body. And it does that by traveling through the bloodstream and attaching to those cells. So this is going to be long distance, like if you were calling somebody over the phone. You don't have to be right there beside them, but yet you can still communicate. All right, now this right here is a very important slide. Okay, this is a must know here. This is a big idea of cell signaling. So there's three main stages, okay? If you know anything about cell signaling, you need to know that the three stages are reception, transduction, and response. So essentially, the message is going to get received. This is going to be all the middle stuff, and then ultimately the cell is going to do something. And so every cell communication pathway, it doesn't matter which one it is, it's going to start with reception. The message is received. Now, in this case, the reception involves a signal binding to a protein, okay? As we've talked about already, in more than one instance, proteins are always very specific. So if it's a neurotransmitter, there is a specific type of protein that is going to receive that neurotransmitter. If it's a hormone, there's going to be a specific type of protein that's going to receive that hormone. So the signal and the protein receptor are always going to be specific, okay? It's not like you just have a general receptor that receives any chemical messenger. The cells, the target cell, is going to be the cells that actually have those protein receptors for that chemical signal. So all that's happening here is a chemical signal binds to a protein. Now, once that happens, that's going to trigger a change in the protein. Anytime something binds to a protein, it's going to cause that protein to change shape. And in turn, that protein is going to lead to, a lot of times, a series of events, a kind of a chain reaction of sorts. And so transduction is converting that chemical signal to some other type of message that's going to be carried into the cell. There's a lot of different things that can be involved here. Like I said, it can be like a cascade or a chain of events, or it can be a single step. It's going to involve different components, but essentially transduction is just the middle stuff, what happens in the middle. And then the response is the cell does something. So the cell might copy a gene. The cell might divide. The immune cell might digest the pathogen. Okay, the cell is ultimately going to do something. All right, so what we're going to talk about over the next several slides, we're just going to go into these three steps in a little bit more detail. Once again, this is still an overview. These are things that could be involved in a signal transduction pathway. So once again, the very first step is reception, okay? So in reception, a chemical messenger, another name for that is called a ligand. The ligand, once again, could be a neurotransmitter, it could be an ion, it could be a hormone. It's just a chemical messenger. So the ligand is going to bind to a receptor protein, okay? And these proteins are typically going to be on the cell membrane. And so the chemical messenger, like a neurotransmitter, is going to bind to a protein. And once again, always specific. Now, at this point, once that happens, once the signal binds to the protein, that protein receptor is going to change shape, or it's going to have a conformation change. That means the same thing. And then that change in the protein is going to trigger the transduction pathway. Okay, so initially the ligand binds to the protein and the protein changes shape. Now, these three are just some examples of specific types of receptors, okay? You don't have to know the specifics of these, just recognize that each of these are examples of protein receptors that could be receiving that message. So I'm going to kind of try to explain them to you in a little more detail, but all you really have to know are the examples. So this is an example of a G protein linked receptor. And so what happens here is this is my signal molecule, okay, this is my ligand, and this is my G protein linked receptor, okay? So basically what happens in this kind of instance is the signal molecule binds. It's going to kind of activate what's called a G protein. GTP is kind of like ATP. And that G protein is going to go on and activate enzymes, okay? So receptor binds, this is where the receptor binds to the signal molecule, this is reception. This protein changes shape, and that's going to trigger the G protein to activate enzymes. And a lot of times you could have enzymes that are going to activate other enzymes and so forth. Like I said, a lot of times they're chain reactions. So that's one example of a receptor. Another example is a tyrosine kinase. Now this is what we call a dimer. It has two kind of like identical molecules. And in this case, these would be my ligands. Okay, notice they have a specific shape to match the receptor. When the signal molecules bind, it actually causes these two dimers to come together, and that's actually going to trigger phosphorylation. Remember how we talked about on our cell respiration glycolysis diagram, anytime you see kinases phosphorylate. So this tyrosine kinase receptor, when the signal molecules bind, it triggers the phosphorylation of other proteins or the energizing of other proteins, and then ultimately that's going to lead to a cell response. And then a third type of receptor is a ligand-gated ion channel. So in this case, the ligand binds, and when the ligand binds, it opens a channel and it allows molecules to pass through. So the key is you have reception. A ligand, which is some kind of chemical messenger, binds to a protein, and that protein changes shape. And so these last three slides are just examples of some of those receptors that you can find in your cells. All right, so the next step in the pathway is going to be transduction, which was the middle stuff. So it's all the things that could happen in the middle. We are not going to look at any one specific pathway. We are going to look at things that could be involved in the transduction stage, okay? So we could have signaling cascades, we could have amplification of a signal, we could have second messengers. Now, the first messenger is the ligand. The second messengers are going to be chemicals that are going to carry that message forward into the cell. Or we could also see things like phosphorylation. So once again, this is very general. These are things that could be involved in the transduction pathway. So first, let's take a look at second messenger. So these are just going to be small molecules. And so here's my first messenger, the ligand. It's going to bind in the process of reception. All of this stuff that happens in the middle is transduction. So you can see here that this G protein is going to activate an enzyme. That enzyme is going to trigger the release of the second messenger. In this case, it's called cyclic AMP. And then that second messenger is going to carry that message forward into the cell, okay? So what second messengers do is they rapidly spread through the cell by diffusion, and they carry that message forward, okay? Now your two common examples are cyclic AMP. It's kind of like ATP, but it just has one phosphate. And then you have calcium ions, okay? One of your most common is probably calcium ions. We see this involved like in nerve transmission and muscle contraction, so calcium is a pretty frequently seen second messenger. And so what second messengers do is it only takes one first messenger, and then as those second messengers diffuse into the cell, they can actually cause many events. So they kind of get distributed. Lots of second messengers can get released. And so a single ligand can lead to many events inside the cell. And so what second messengers often do is they amplify the signal. So one ligand can trigger the release of many second messengers. Now something else that might be involved in the transduction pathway, that middle portion, is we can have phosphorylation. Protein kinases, once again, we've seen this before, these are enzymes that phosphorylate. Now, if you phosphorylate something, you energize it. You transfer a phosphate and therefore transfer energy. So this is when a phosphate is transferred from ATP to another molecule. So that could be transferred to another protein, it could be transferred to some other kind of molecule, but essentially what this does is it creates this phosphorylation cascade. So you just have a series of phosphorylations and you have molecules becoming activated or energized. You'll see kinases involved in the cell cycle, and sometimes if you aren't, if your proteins are not made correctly, if there's too many or not enough, this is one of the contributions to cancer, is if you had some issues with kinases. So essentially kinases activate. Now there's another type of protein called a phosphatase, and this does the opposite, where kinases phosphorylate, the phosphatases remove phosphates and therefore kind of deactivate or de-energize. And so they kind of shut down a pathway. And typically the activities are going to involve both. You'll have protein kinases that activate, and then you'll have protein phosphatases that deactivate. Just know that both of these could be involved in the transduction pathway. Okay, once again, we're not covering anything specific. These are just general things that could be a part of transduction. And then the final stage of cell communication is the cell does something. The cell responds. And so this is going to be the end of the pathway, and at this point the target cell does something. So that could be the opening of a channel and molecules pass through. That could be an enzyme is activated, kind of that allosteric regulation. The cell could divide. It could, a lot of times, we'll see this later on in the semester, a lot of times it could lead to gene regulation, like a gene is turned on or a gene is turned off, and that's going to in turn affect protein synthesis. It could be a nerve impulse is transmitted, it could be a hormone or other molecule is released, it could be the immune cell responds, the muscle moves, whatever it is. So depending on the type of target cell, that will ultimately affect what is the response of the cell to that signal. Now the signal transduction ends after the cell responds, and essentially that pathway, all of those proteins that are involved are going to go back to their original condition. We do see a balance between regulating enzymes and those responses, okay? So a lot of times enzymes are involved each step of the way. And so the way we can kind of balance out the enzyme activity is through the making or the breaking down of that enzyme. A lot of that has to do with gene regulation. Or we could see, like in that allosteric regulation, the enzymes could be activated or inhibited by other molecules. So the activity of the enzyme is just going to be regulated. And once again, everything in these pathways, anytime we're talking about proteins, it's going to be specific, specific, specific. Different cells have different kinds of proteins. That's going to determine what the chemical messengers are that can affect them. If they don't have a receptor for that molecule cannot trigger a response, okay? So how a cell responds is going to depend on the types of receptors that it has, the second messengers and relay proteins that it has, and any other proteins that are made in that cell. And this is essentially why cells do different things. It's all about the proteins that they have. What enzymes do they have? What receptors do they have? This is what makes a nerve cell, a muscle cell, a muscle cell, a skin cell, a skin cell. It's all based on the proteins that they have, and that's going to depend on the responses that they can have depending on chemical signals. All right, now what if you have a change in the pathway? Okay, once again, these are very specific, and a lot of times they're chain reactions. This triggers this, which triggers this, which triggers this. Well, essentially, if the pathway is not working properly, if it's overproducing or underproducing or not working at all, then essentially that's going to lead to disease, or that's going to lead to improper development, or in some cases it could lead to death. So these are very specific pathways that if they're not working properly is going to lead to problems. So typically when you take a medication, a lot of medications are going to kind of intervene somewhere along these pathways. So birth control involves hormones that kind of tell the body, kind of trick the body a little bit, maybe prevent it from ovulating or something like that. Antidepressants usually have to deal with neurotransmitters and how the body is releasing them or receiving them. Any kind of metabolic control. Remember, metabolism is just chemical reactions. So these medications, what they do is they act somewhere and either kind of shut down or inhibit, or they promote these cell communication pathways. All right, now one example of a cell communication pathway that some cells will demonstrate is something called apoptosis. And this is literally programmed cell death or cell suicide. And so some cells do this naturally. This is not always a bad thing. This is normal for like development. When you're developing in the womb, you have webbing between your fingers and toes. That webbing goes away. How does that happen? Apoptosis. A lot of cells, when they're damaged, they will kind of get the message that they are damaged and they will go through apoptosis. Sometimes we want cells to do that and they don't, and that can lead to more problems like cancer. And so apoptosis is just an example of a cell communication pathway, with apoptosis being the end result. So what can happen is signals are going to activate kind of these series of suicide proteins, and the cell will literally kind of be broken down and digested. And so a lot of times this is involved like in disease. If you have an infected cell, it'll kind of take one for the team and it'll go through apoptosis. But like I mentioned, sometimes if this doesn't happen like it needs to, it can lead to more problems. And that is going to be the end of your cell communication notes. Now, in your study guide, the front page is just kind of an overview review of cell communication, those basic steps. Okay, once again, I know this may feel kind of detailed, but it's actually quite general. What you need to know are the three main steps of a cell communication pathway. You need to know kind of the differences between the short distance and the long distance. And you need to know what could be involved in reception, what could be involved in transduction, and what could be involved in response. Okay, so if that's kind of how you want to tackle the notes. Now, it's kind of hard to find practice for this. It's kind of hard to find good labs for this. And so what you're going to be working on throughout this unit is, it's just going to be a web quest. Okay, so I found some good websites and created some questions. One part of your web quest is going to be over cell communication, and one part of your web quest is going to be over the cell cycle. I think you're going to work on that tomorrow. You may even start on it today, but hopefully that'll help you kind of process this information in another way than just doing a set of notes. So good luck to you guys. You will have a quiz, and that quiz is going to cover both cell communication and the cell cycle. It's going to cover more than one set of notes. So I hope this is helpful, and if you have any questions, just email me and let me know, and I hope you all have a great day.